Hey everyone, we're back with Chapter 3 of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by JK Rowling. So, before we get to that chapter, I want to do a quick review of our first two chapters. So, pause the video, review it with those who you're watching this with, and then come back, and here's my review. We have read Chapter 1 and 2, and first chapter is called The Boy Who Lived. He is Harry Potter, and we learn that Harry Potter's parents were killed by an evil wizard named Voldemort. Albus Dumbledore, Hagrid, and Professor McGonagall brought Harry, with a little lightning scar on his forehead, to his aunt and uncles. Now, Harry is the boy who lived, because that horrible person, Voldemort, tried to kill him too, but he survived, and Voldemort disappeared. So, Harry is now with his not very nice aunt and uncle and cousin, the Dursleys. In the second chapter, we have moved forward 10 years, and it's Dudley Dursley, his cousin's, birthday. They go to the zoo with his friend, and Harry gets to tag along for the first time in his life. Well, something strange happens, and the glass disappears. That's why the chapter is called The Vanishing Glass, in front of a ginormous boa constrictor. Well, Harry was right there and kind of having a conversation with the snake, so his aunt and uncle were not very pleased, and he ended up hanging out in the cupboard, which his aunt and uncle make him use as a bedroom. So, here we go. We're going on to Chapter 3, titled The Letters to No One. Now, while you listen to the story, think about it and really think about that title of how it matters and what it means. All right, here goes. Chapter 3 of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Chapter 3, The Letters from No One. The escape of the Brazilian boa constrictor earned Harry his longest ever punishment. By the time he was allowed out of his cupboard again, the summer holidays had started, and Dudley had already broken his new Cinecamera, crashed his remote control aeroplane, and first time on his racing bike, knocked down old Mrs. Figg as she crossed Privet Drive on her crutches. Harry was glad school was over, but there was no escaping Dudley's gang, who visited the house every single day. Piers, Dennis, Malcolm, and Gordon were all big and stupid. But as Dudley was the biggest and stupidest of the lot, he was the leader. The rest of them were all quite happy to join in Dudley's favorite sport, Harry hunting. This was why Harry spent as much time as possible out of the house, wandering around and thinking about the end of the holidays, where he could see a tiny ray of hope. When September came he would be going off to secondary school. For the first time in his life, he wouldn't be at the same school as Dudley. Dudley had a place at Uncle Vernon's old school, Smeltings. Piers Polkins was going there too. Harry, on the other hand, was going to Stonewall High, the local comprehensive. Dudley thought this was very funny. "They stuff people's heads down the toilet the first day at Stonewall," he told Harry. "Want to come upstairs and practice?" "No, thanks," said Harry. "The poor toilet's never had anything as horrible as your head down it. It might be sick." Then he ran, before Dudley could work out what he said in his head. One day in July, Aunt Petunia took Dudley to London to buy his Smeltings uniform, leaving Harry at Mrs. Figg's. Mrs. Figg's wasn't as bad as usual. It turned out she'd broken her leg tripping over one of her cats, and didn't seem quite as fond of them as before. She let Harry watch television, gave him a bit of chocolate cake that tasted as though she'd had it for several years. That evening, Dudley paraded around the living room for the family in his brand new uniform. Smelting's boys wore maroon tailcoats, orange knickerbockers, and flat straw hats called boaters. They also carried knobbly sticks used for hitting each other while teachers weren't looking. This was supposed to be good training for later life. As he looked at Dudley in his new knickerbockers, Uncle Vernon said gruffly that it was the proudest moment of his life. Aunt Petunia burst into tears and said she couldn't believe that her icky Duddykins he looked so handsome and grown up. Harry didn't trust himself to speak. He thought 2 of his ribs might already have cracked from trying not to laugh. There was a horrible smell in the kitchen the next morning when Harry went in for breakfast. It seemed to be coming from the large metal tub in the sink. He went to have a look. The tub was full of what looked like dirty rags swimming in gray water. "What's this?" he asked Aunt Petunia. Her lips tightened, as they always did if he dared to ask a question. "Your new school uniform," she said, and Harry looked in the bowl again. "Oh," he said, "I didn't realize it had to be so wet." "Don't be stupid," snapped Aunt Petunia. "I'm dyeing some of Dudley's old things gray for you. It'll look just like everyone else's when I've finished." Harry seriously doubted this, but thought best not to argue. He sat down at the table and tried not to think about how he was going to look on his first day at Stonewall High. Like he was wearing bits of old elephant skin, probably. Dudley and Uncle Vernon came in, both with wrinkled noses because of the smell from Harry's new uniform. Uncle Vernon opened his newspaper as usual, and Dudley banged his smelting stick, which he carried everywhere, on the table. They heard the click of the letterbox and the flop of the letters on the doormat. "Get the post, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon from behind his paper. "Make Harry get it." "Get the post, Harry." "Make Dudley get it." "Poke him with your smelting stick, Dudley." Harry dodged the smelting stick and went to get the post. 3 things lay on the doormat. A postcard from Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, who was holidaying on the Isle of Wight, a brown envelope that looked like a bill, and a letter for Harry. Harry picked it up and stared at it, his heart twanging like a giant elastic band. No one ever in his whole life had written him. Who would? He had no friends, no other relatives. He didn't belong to the library, so he would never get rude notes asking for books back. Yet here it was, a letter, addressed so plainly there could be no mistake. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The envelope was thick and heavy, made of yellowish parchment, and the address was written in emerald green ink. There was no stamp. Turning the envelope over in his hand started trembling. Harry saw a purple wax seal bearing a coat of arms, a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake surrounding a large letter H. "Hurry up, boy!" shouted Uncle Vernon from the kitchen. "What are you doing? Checking for letter bombs?" He chuckled at his own joke. Harry went back to the kitchen, still staring at his letter. He handed Uncle Vernon the bill and the postcard, sat down, and slowly began to open the yellow envelope. Uncle Vernon ripped open the bill, snorted in disgust, and flipped over the postcard. "Marge is ill," he informed Aunt Petunia. "Ate funny whelk." "Dad!" said Dudley suddenly. "Dad, Harry's got something!" Harry was on the point of unfolding his letter, which was written in the same heavy parchment as the envelope, when it was jerked sharply out of his hand by Uncle Vernon. "That's mine," said Harry, trying to snatch it back. "Who'd be writing you?" sneered Uncle Vernon, shaking the letter open with one hand and glancing at it. His face went from red to green faster than a set of traffic lights. And it didn't stop there. Within seconds was grayish-white of old porridge. "Petunia!" he gasped. Dudley tried to grab the letter to read it, but Uncle Vernon held it high out of his reach. Aunt Petunia took it curiously and read the first line. For a moment it looked as though she might faint. She clutched her throat and made a choking noise. "Vernon! Oh, goodness, Vernon!" They stared at each other, seeming to have forgotten that Harry and Dudley were still in the room. Dudley wasn't used to being ignored. He gave his father a sharp tap on the head with his smelting stick. "I want to read that letter," he said loudly. "I want to read it," said Harry furiously, "as it's mine." "Get out, both of you," croaked Uncle Vernon, stuffing the letter back inside his envelope. Harry didn't move. "I want my letter," he shouted. "Let me see it," demanded Dudley. "Out!" roared Uncle Vernon, and he took both Harry and Dudley by the scruffs of their necks and threw them into the hall, slamming the kitchen door behind him. Harry and Dudley promptly had a furious but silent fight over who would listen at the keyhole. Dudley won, so Harry, his glasses dangling from one ear, lay flat on his stomach to listen at the crack between the door and the floor. "Vernon," Aunt Petunia was saying in a quivering voice, "look at the address. How could they possibly know where he sleeps? You don't think they've been watching the house?" "Watching, spying, might be following us," muttered Uncle Vernon wildly. "But what should we do, Vernon? Should we write back? Tell them we don't want—" Harry could see Uncle Vernon's shiny black shoes pacing up and down the kitchen. "No," he said firmly. "No, we'll ignore it. If they don't get an answer, yes, that's best. We won't do anything." "But—" "I'm not having one in the house, Petunia. Didn't we swear when we took him in we'd stamp out that dangerous nonsense?" That evening, when he got back from work, Uncle Vernon did something he'd never done before. He visited Harry in his cupboard. "Where's my letter?" said Harry, the moment Uncle Vernon had squeezed through the door. "Who's writing me?" "No one. It was addressed to you by mistake." And Uncle Vernon shortly, "I have burned it." "It was not a mistake," said Harry angrily. "It had my cupboard on it." "Silence!" yelled Uncle Vernon, and a couple of spiders fell from the ceiling. He took a few deep breaths, and then forced his face into a smile, which looked painful. Yes, Harry, about the cupboard. Your aunt and I have been thinking. You're really getting a bit big for it. We think it might be nice if you moved into Dudley's second bedroom." "Why?" said Harry. "Don't ask questions," snapped his uncle. "Take this stuff upstairs now." The Dursleys' house had 4 bedrooms, one for Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, one for visitors, usually Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, one where Dudley slept, and one where Dudley kept all his toys and things that wouldn't fit into his first bedroom. It only took Harry 1 trip upstairs to move everything he owned from the cupboard to the room. He sat down on the bed and stared around him. Nearly everything in the room was broken. The month-old Cinecamera was lying on the top of a small working tank Dudley had once driven over the next-door neighbor's dog. In the corner was Dudley's first ever television set, which he'd put his foot through when his favorite program had been canceled. There was a large bird cage, which had once held a parrot that Dudley had swapped at school for a real air rifle, which was up on a shelf at the end, all bent because Dudley had sat on it. Other shelves were full of books. These were the only things in the room that looked as though they'd never been touched. From downstairs came a sound of Dudley bawling at his mother. "I don't want him in there. I need that room. Make him get out." Harry sighed and stretched out on the bed. Yesterday he'd given anything to be up here. Today he'd rather be in his cupboard with that letter than up here without it. Next morning at breakfast, everyone was rather quiet. Dudley was in shock. He'd screamed, whacked his father with its smelting stick, even got sick on purpose, kicked his mother and thrown his tortoise through the greenhouse roof, and he still didn't have his room back. Harry was thinking about this time yesterday and bitterly wishing he had opened the letter in the hall. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia kept looking at each other darkly. When the post arrived, Uncle Vernon, who seemed to be trying to be nice to Harry, made Dudley go and get it. They heard him banging things with his smelting stick all the way down the hall. Then he shouted, "There's another one! Mr. H. Potter, the smallest bedroom, 4 Privet Drive." With a strangled cry, Uncle Vernon leapt up from his seat, ran down the hall, Harry right behind him. Uncle Vernon had to wrestle Dudley to the ground to get the letter from him, which was difficult by the fact that Harry had grabbed Uncle Vernon around the neck from behind. Another minute of confused fighting, in which everyone got hit a lot by a smelting stick. Uncle Vernon straightened up, grasping for breath, with Harry's letter clutched in his hand. "Go to your cupboard, I mean your bedroom," he wheezed at Harry. "Dudley, go, just go." Harry walked round and round in his new room. Someone knew he had been moved out of his cupboard, and they seemed to know he hadn't received his first letter. Surely that meant they'd try again, and this time he'd make sure they didn't fail. He had a plan. The repaired alarm clock rang at 6 o'clock the next morning. Harry had turned it off quickly, been dressed silently. He mustn't wake the Dursleys. He stole downstairs without turning on any lights. He was going to wait for the postman on the corner of Privet Drive and get the letters for number 4 first. His heart hammered as he crept across the dark hall towards the front door. Ah! Harry leapt into the air. He'd trodden on something big and squashy on the doormat. Something alive! Lights clicked on upstairs, and to his horror, Harry realized that the big squashy something had been his uncle's face. Uncle Vernon had been laying at the front door on the front doormat of the front door in a sleeping bag, clearly making sure that Harry didn't do exactly what he'd been trying to do. He shouted at Harry for about half an hour and then told him to go and make a cup of tea. Harry shuffled miserably off into the kitchen, and by the time he got back, the post had arrived, right into Uncle Vernon's lap. Harry could see that there were 3 letters addressed to him in green ink. "I want," he began, but Uncle Vernon was tearing the letters into pieces before his eyes. Uncle Vernon didn't go to work that day. He stayed at home and nailed up the letterbox. "See," he explained to Aunt Petunia through a mouthful of nails, "if they can't deliver them, they'll just give up." "I'm not sure that will work, Vernon." "Oh, these people's minds work in mysterious, strange ways, Petunia. They're not like you and me." And Uncle Vernon trying to knock in a nail with a piece of fruitcake Aunt Petunia had just given him. On Friday, no fewer than 12 letters arrived for Harry. As they couldn't go through the letterbox, they had been pushed under the door, slotted through the sides, and even forced through a small window in the downstairs toilet. Uncle Vernon stayed home again. After burning all of the letters, he got a hammer and nails and boarded up the cracks along the front door and the back doors so no one could go out. He hummed Tiptoe Through the Tulips as he worked, and jumped at all small noises. On Saturday, things began to get out of hand. 24 letters to Harry found their way into the house. Rolled up and hidden inside each of the 24 eggs that their very confused milkman had handed Petunia through the living room window, while Uncle Vernon made furious telephone calls to the post office and the dairy, trying to find someone to explain to. Aunt Petunia shredded the letters in her food mixer. "Who on earth wants to talk to you this badly?" Dudley asked Harry in amazement. On Sunday morning, Uncle Vernon sat down at the breakfast table, looking tired and rather ill, but happy. "No post on Sundays," he reminded them happily as he spread marmalade on his newspapers. "No letters today." Something came whizzing down the kitchen chimney as he spoke, and caught him sharply in the back of the head. Next moment, 30 or 40 letters came pelting out of the fireplace like bullets. The Dursleys ducked, but Harry leapt into the air, trying to catch one. Out! Out! Uncle Vernon seized Harry around the waist and threw him into the hall. Then Aunt Petunia and Dudley had to run out with their arms over their faces. Uncle Vernon slammed the door shut. They could hear the letters still streaming into the room, bouncing off the walls and floor. "That does it," said Uncle Vernon, trying to speak calmly, but pulling great tufts out of his mustache at the same time. "I want you all back here in 5 minutes, ready to leave. We're going away. Just pack some clothes. No arguments." He looked so dangerous, with half of his mustache missing, that no one dared argue. 10 minutes later, they had wrenched their way through the boarded-up doors and were in the car, speeding towards the motorway. Dudley was sniffling in the back seat. His father had hit him around the head for holding them up while he tried to pack his television, video, and computer in his sports bag. They drove, and they drove. Even Aunt Petunia didn't dare ask where they were going. Every now and then, Uncle Vernon would take a sharp turn and drive in the opposite direction. "Shake 'em off. Shake 'em off," he would mutter whenever he did that. They didn't stop to eat or drink all day. By nightfall, Dudley was howling. He'd never had such a bad day in his life. He was hungry. He'd missed 5 television programs he'd wanted to see, and he'd never gone this long without blowing up an alien on his computer. Uncle Vernon stopped at last outside a gloomy-looking hotel on the outskirts of a big city. Dudley and Harry shared a room with twin beds and damp, musty sheets. Dudley snored, but Harry stayed awake, sitting on the windowsill, staring down at the lights of cars and wondering. They ate stale cornflakes and cold tinned tomatoes on toast for breakfast the next day. They had just finished when the owner of the hotel came over to their table. "Excuse me, but is one of you Mr. H. Potter? Only I got about 100 of these at the front desk." They held up a letter so they could read the green address. "Mr. H. Potter, room 17, Railview Hotel, Cokeworth." Harry made a grab for the letter, but Uncle Vernon knocked his hand out of the way. The woman stared. "I'll take them," said Uncle Vernon, standing up quickly and following her from the dining room. "Wouldn't it be better just to go home, dear?" Aunt Petunia suggested timidly hours later, but Uncle Vernon didn't seem to hear her. Exactly what he was looking for, none of them knew. He drove them into the middle of the forest, got out, looked around, shook his head, got back in the car, and off they went again. The same thing happened in the middle of a plowed field, halfway across a suspension bridge, and at the top of a multi-story car park. "Daddy's gone mad, hasn't he?" Dudley asked Aunt Petunia dully late in the afternoon. Uncle Vernon had parked on the coast, locked them all inside the car, and disappeared. It started to rain. Great drops beat on the roof of the car. Dudley sniffled. "It's Monday," he told his mother. "The great humburrito's on tonight. I want to stay somewhere with a television." Monday? This reminded Harry of something. If it was Monday, and you could always count on Dudley to know the days of the week because of television, then tomorrow, Tuesday, was Harry's 11th birthday. Of course, his birthdays were never exactly fun. Last year, the Dursleys had given him a coat hanger and a pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks. Still, you weren't 11 every day. Uncle Vernon was back, and he was smiling. He was also carrying a long, thin package and didn't answer Aunt Petunia when she asked what he'd bought. "Found the perfect place," he said. "Come on, everyone out." It was very cold outside the car. Uncle Vernon was pointing at what looked like a large rock way out to sea. Perched on top of the rock was the most miserable little shack you could imagine. One thing was certain, there was no television in there. "Storm forecast for tonight," said Uncle Vernon gleefully, clapping his hands together, "and this gentleman's kindly agreed to lend us his boat." A toothless old man came ambling out at them, pointing, with a rather wicked grin, at an old rowing boat bobbing in the iron-gray water below them. "I've already got us some rations," he said, "so all aboard." It was freezing in the boat. Icy sea spray and rain crept down their necks, and a chilly wind whipped their faces. After what seemed like hours, they reached the rock, where Uncle Vernon, slipping and sliding, led the way to the broken-down house. And the inside was horrible. It smelled strongly of seaweed. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the fireplace was damp and empty. There were only 2 rooms. Uncle Vernon's rations turned out to be a packet of crisps each and 4 bananas. He tried to start a fire, but the empty crisp packets just smoked and shriveled up. Could you do with some of those letters now, eh?" he said cheerfully. He was in a very good mood. Obviously, he thought nobody stood a chance of reaching them here in a storm to deliver the post. Harry privately agreed, though the thought didn't cheer him up at all. As night fell, the promised storm blew up around them. Spray from the high waves splattered the walls of the hut, and a fierce wind rattled the filthy windows. Aunt Petunia found a few moldy blankets in the second room and made up a bed for Dudley on the moth-eaten sofa. She and Uncle Vernon went off to the lumpy bed next door, and Harry was left to find the softest bit of floor he could, and curled up under the thinnest, most ragged blanket. The storm raged more and more ferociously as the night went on. Harry couldn't sleep. He shivered and turned over, trying to get comfortable. His stomach was rumbling with hunger. Dudley's snores were drowned by the low rolls of thunder that started near midnight. The lighted dial of Dudley's watch, which was dangling over the edge of the sofa on his fat wrist, told Harry he'd be 11 in 10 minutes' time. He lay and watched his birthday tick nearer, wondering if the Dursleys would remember at all, wondering where the letter writer was now. 5 minutes to go. Harry heard something creak outside. He hoped the roof wasn't going to fall in, although he might be warmer if it did. 4 minutes to go. Maybe the house on Privet Drive would be so full of letters when they got back that he'd be able to steal one somehow. 3 minutes to go. Was that the sea slapping hard on the rock like that? And 2 minutes to go. What was that funny crunching noise? Was the rock crumbling into the sea? 1 minute to go, and he'd be 11. 30 seconds, 20, 10, 9. Maybe he'd wake Dudley up just to annoy him. 3, 2, 1. Boom! The whole shack shivered, and Harry sat bolt upright, staring at the door. Someone was outside, trying to come in. The end of Letters from No One. So much happened in that chapter. So we are back with our discussion questions of chapter 3, which is titled Letters to No One. My first question are, what are the letters that keep coming to Harry? We don't really know yet, do we? Because no one has let Harry read it. So his aunt and uncle stole it from him, and when they read it, they were terrified and said that he would never get them. So Mr. Dursley was pretty scared. What did he do to keep Harry from getting all of the letters? He did a lot of things, didn't he? First, he boarded up where their letters come in. So instead of a mailbox, they have a little letter box thing opening in their door. And so the mailman would just put them in, and they would fall onto their mat. Well, he boarded it up, and then they came through underneath the door and around it and through the windows. So he boarded those up too. He used nails and wood and covered them. And then they kept coming in other ways. So the chimney, they came in inside an egg, and then they just kept coming. So since they just kept coming to the house, he took them away. So Mr. Dursley said, "We're leaving. Everyone get in the car." They drove miles and miles to this random hotel. The hotel ended up with letters. They had hundreds of them for Harry, and Mr. Dursley would not let him have them. And then, finally, where we leave our friends, on a really deserted island in the middle of nowhere with a shack. 2 rooms. They didn't even have any heat or warmth. Harry had to sleep on the floor, and someone comes a-knocking. So, what at the very end does Harry count down to when he's watching Dudley's watch? He's counting down to his birthday. He's turning 11 years old. All right, our chapter title was Letters to No One. Why do you think that this chapter was titled that? I think it's because no one got to really read them except for Mr. Dursley, did they? So Harry didn't get to read it. Dudley even wanted to read it. But the letters just kept coming. So why do you think that it was important to name this chapter that? Everything that happened in the chapter was because of these letters from nobody, and that Harry never got. So I think we're gonna see where we get to go soon and who is at the door when we come back with chapter 4. So thank you again for joining us for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and we will see you all next time. Bye!